Deep in the forgotten woods of northern Pennsylvania, 4 experienced hikers are about to make a discovery that will haunt them forever. What starts as a weekend adventure through overgrown trails leads them to something that shouldn't exist, an abandoned meat processing factory, silent and decaying, hidden beneath decades of vines and rust. The building seems harmless enough at first. Old machinery, empty offices, faded safety posters on crumbling walls. Just another piece of industrial history reclaimed by nature. But when they find the basement door, sealed with chains and warning signs long faded to nothing, curiosity gets the better of them. What they discover in that underground chamber isn't just disturbing. It's evidence of something that was never meant to be found. What kind of operation required a secret basement in a meat factory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen had been leading hiking expeditions for nearly 40 years, and she could read a trail the way some people read books. At 62, her legs were still strong, her instincts sharp, and her curiosity undiminished by age. She stood at the trailhead that October morning, adjusting the straps on her weathered backpack while waiting for the others to arrive. The leather-bound journal in her front pocket pressed against her ribs, a familiar weight. Every hike she'd ever taken was documented in one of those journals, dozens of them now, filling a shelf in her study back home. This would be number 47. Frank Donovan's truck rumbled into the gravel parking area first, dust rising behind it like a small storm. He climbed out with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent 30 years as a state park ranger and knew that rushing led to mistakes. At 58, Frank still had the build of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, broad-shouldered and solid. His beard had gone completely gray now, but his eyes were the same sharp blue they'd been when Margaret first met him at a conservation conference back in 1998. "Morning. Maggie," he called, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Weather's supposed to hold all weekend." "That's what they said last time," Margaret replied, smiling. "And we spent Saturday night in that ranger station waiting out the storm." "Built character," Frank said. Grinning as he pulled his pack from the truck bed, Diane Keller arrived next, her silver sedan looking out of place among the pickup trucks and SUVs. She emerged with her camera bag slung over one shoulder, her hiking pack over the other. At 55, Diane had the lean, restless energy of someone who'd spent decades chasing the perfect photograph. Her hair, once black, was now streaked with white in a way that somehow made her look distinguished rather than old. She'd been documenting abandoned places for 20 years now, selling her work to magazines and galleries. Old factories, forgotten farmhouses, ghost towns reclaimed by desert and time. "I brought the good lenses," she announced, patting her camera bag. "If we find anything interesting out there, I want proper documentation." "Everything's interesting if you look at it right," Margaret said. A phrase she'd repeated so often it had become something of a group motto. Robert Vance, who everyone called Bobby despite his protestations, arrived last in a Jeep that had seen better days. At 51, he was the youngest of the group, a local historian who taught part-time at the community college and spent the rest of his time researching the region's industrial past. He had the slightly disheveled look of someone who spent more time in archives than outdoors. But he'd proven himself a capable hiker over the years. "Sorry I'm late," Bobby said, hurrying over with his pack half open. "I was looking up some information about this area last night and lost track of time. Find anything interesting?" Margaret asked. "Maybe. There used to be a lot of industry out here in the 50s and 60s. Logging operations, small manufacturing plants, that sort of thing. Most of it's gone now, reclaimed by the forest." He pulled out a folded map covered in his own annotations. "But I found references to something called the Patterson Place. Old-timers mention it sometimes, but nobody seems to know exactly what it was." "Patterson," Frank said. "That's the name on some of the old survey markers out here. I always assumed it was just a family name." Margaret studied the map, tracing the route they'd planned. They were heading into the Allegheny Wilderness, a section of state forest that saw few visitors. The trail they'd chosen would take them through old-growth forest, past abandoned logging roads, and up into the higher elevations where the views stretched for miles. It was a challenging route, but nothing they hadn't done before. The four of them had been hiking together for 15 years now, ever since Margaret had organized a group trip for the County Conservation Society. What started as a one-time event had become an annual tradition, then a quarterly one, and eventually evolved into this loose friendship bound by shared trails and campfire conversations. They'd seen each other through divorces and retirements, through the loss of parents and the joy of grandchildren. They knew each other's hiking rhythms, their strengths and limitations, the stories they told and the silences they kept. They set out just after 9, falling into their usual formation with Margaret in the lead and Frank bringing up the rear. The trail started easy, winding through mixed hardwood forest, where the morning sun filtered through leaves just beginning to turn. Diane stopped frequently to photograph mushrooms growing on fallen logs, frost patterns on stones, the way light caught in spiderwebs stretched between branches. "You're going to fill that memory card before lunch," Bobby observed, watching her crouch to capture a cluster of bright orange fungi. "That's why I brought 6 cards," Diane replied without looking up. "Besides, you never know which shot is going to be the one. I've sold photographs I almost didn't take because I thought they were too ordinary." The trail climbed gradually, following an old creek bed that had carved a path through the hillside over thousands of years. Margaret consulted her maps periodically, though she knew this section well enough to navigate by memory. They'd hiked parts of this area before, but never this exact route. That was the appeal, really. After 46 journals worth of hikes, finding new ground required creativity and research. By noon, they'd covered 6 miles and stopped for lunch on a rock outcropping that offered views across the valley. The forest stretched in every direction, a sea of green and gold, broken only by the occasional ridgeline. No roads visible from here, no power lines, no signs of human presence except the narrow trail they'd followed. "This is why I do it," Frank said, biting into a sandwich. 6 miles from the parking lot, and we might as well be in another century." Margaret opened her journal and sketched the view, adding notes about the weather, the trail conditions, the species of trees they'd passed. It was a habit from her teaching days, when field observations were part of her curriculum. Even retired, she couldn't shake the practice of documenting everything. "So tell us more about this Patterson place," Diane said, turning to Bobby. "You said old-timers mention it." Bobby pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos he'd taken of old newspaper clippings. "I found a few references in the County Historical Society archives. Nothing detailed, mostly just mentions in passing. There was some kind of industrial operation out here in the 60s. The references call it Patterson Protein Processing, which suggests it was a meat-packing plant or something similar." "Out here?" Frank frowned. "That doesn't make sense. You'd want that kind of facility near transportation, near towns. This area's always been remote." "That's what caught my attention," Bobby said. "The location doesn't fit the business model. But there are property records showing the Patterson Corporation owned about 200 acres out here from 1955 to 1971. Then the land reverted to the state and was eventually incorporated into the forest. Preserve. What happened to the buildings?" Margaret asked. "That's the thing. The records don't say. Most industrial sites from that era, you can find demolition permits or environmental cleanup documentation. This one just seems to have been abandoned and forgotten." They finished lunch and continued hiking, following the trail as it wound deeper into the forest. The terrain grew rougher, the path less maintained. This section saw fewer visitors, which meant more deadfall across the trail, more places where erosion had changed the route. It was slower going, but none of them minded. The challenge was part of the appeal. Around 3 o'clock, Margaret noticed something that made her pause. An old logging road, barely visible beneath years of overgrowth, branched off from the main trail. She'd seen logging roads before, dozens of them, but this one had something different. The road was wider than most, and she could see remnants of gravel under the vegetation. Someone had put more effort into this road than a typical logging operation would warrant. "Bobby!" she called. "Come look at this." He studied the overgrown road, then pulled out his annotated map. His finger traced the area, then stopped. "This isn't on any of the current maps, but if I'm reading these old survey markers right, this road heads in the direction where the Patterson property would have been." The four of them stood at the junction, looking down the forgotten road. It disappeared into the forest. After about 50 yards, swallowed by saplings and undergrowth, "We could take a look," Diane said, her photographer's curiosity clearly piqued. "If there's something down there worth documenting." Frank checked his watch. "We've got maybe 3 hours of good daylight left. If we're going to explore, we should do it now, and then decide whether to camp or push on to the planned site." Margaret felt the familiar pull of discovery, the same feeling that had driven her through decades of field research. Every fallen log might shelter a rare salamander. Every unexplored hollow might contain something worth documenting. It was the reason she'd become a biologist in the first place, that fundamental curiosity about what lay just beyond the known. "Let's give it an hour," she decided. "If we don't find anything interesting, we'll come back and continue on the main trail." They left their larger packs at the junction, taking only water and essentials. The old road was harder to follow than it first appeared. Nature had been reclaiming it for over 50 years, and in places the route was more guess than certainty. But someone had built this road well. Beneath the leaf litter and moss, Margaret could feel the solid base, the careful grading that had gone into its construction. Bobby kept consulting his phone's compass, making sure they were still heading in the right direction. The forest here felt different, older somehow. The trees were massive, their trunks thick enough that it would take 3 people to circle them with linked arms. This was old-growth forest, the kind that had somehow escaped the aggressive logging of the previous century. "Listen," Frank said suddenly, holding up his hand. They all stopped. At first, Margaret heard nothing but the usual forest sounds, wind in the branches, a distant crow calling. Then she caught it, a different quality to the silence ahead, the subtle echo that comes from sound, bouncing off something solid and man-made. They continued more cautiously now, and after another 100 yards, the forest opened slightly. Through the trees, Margaret saw it, a building, massive and industrial, so covered in vines and vegetation that it seemed to be emerging from the earth itself rather than sitting upon it. The structure was at least 3 stories tall, built from concrete and steel that had weathered to the color of the surrounding stone. "My God," Diane whispered, already raising her camera. "It's beautiful." And it was, in the way that abandoned places are beautiful. Nature and human construction locked in their eternal struggle, neither quite winning, both transformed by the encounter. The building's windows were mostly broken, but a few remained intact, their glass clouded with decades of grime. A rusted metal sign hung at an angle near what had once been the main entrance, the letters barely legible. Bobby walked closer, squinting at the sign. "Patterson Protein Processing," he read aloud. "Established 1955. The loading dock had collapsed on one side, concrete chunks scattered across what had once been a paved lot. Now saplings pushed up through cracks in the pavement, determined to turn this industrial scar back into forest. A chain-link fence had once surrounded the property, but it had long since rusted through and fallen in places. Margaret approached slowly, her scientific training asserting itself. She made mental notes of the building's condition, the species of plants colonizing it, the way water damage had traced patterns down the concrete walls. This place had been abandoned quickly, she realized. There were no signs of organized demolition, no evidence of salvage operations. Someone had simply walked away and left it to decay. "Should we go inside?" Diane asked, though her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind. Frank examined the structure critically, his ranger's eye assessing safety. "The building looks solid enough. Concrete and steel construction. But we need to be careful about the floors inside, especially if there's been water damage." Margaret knew they should probably mark the location, report it to the Forest Service, and let proper authorities investigate. That would be the responsible thing to do. But standing here, looking at this forgotten piece of history hidden in the forest, she felt that old pull of discovery. How many people had walked these trails over the past 50 years and never found this place? How many secrets did those broken windows hide? 1 hour, she said firmly. We document what we can, we're careful about our safety, and then we decide our next steps. They circled the building first, staying on the outside, taking in the full scope of what they'd found. The structure was larger than Margaret had initially realized, extending back into the hillside in a way that suggested portions of it might be built into the rock itself. There were multiple entrances, all of them chained or boarded, though time and weather had made many of these barriers more symbolic than functional. Diane photographed everything, moving around the building's perimeter with practiced efficiency. She captured the way vines had wrapped around rusted machinery, visible through broken windows, the geometric patterns of broken glass, the contrast between industrial decay and natural reclamation. Her camera clicked steadily, documenting this forgotten place. Bobby found a side entrance where the boards had rotted away completely, leaving an opening large enough to enter. The door itself hung crooked on broken hinges, and beyond it they could see what looked like a receiving area or loading zone. Daylight filtered through the broken windows, providing enough illumination to see inside. "This is it," Frank said. "If we're going in, this is probably our best access point. But I want everyone to stick together. No wandering off alone." Margaret pulled a flashlight from her belt, even though the afternoon sun was still providing light. Old habits from decades of fieldwork. Always be prepared, always have backup, always assume conditions could change. She'd taught those principles to hundreds of students over the years, and they'd served her well. They entered single file, Frank leading now with his own light scanning ahead. The interior smelled of rust and mold, that particular scent of industrial spaces left to decay. The receiving area was large, with a concrete floor and metal support columns rising to the ceiling. Chains hung from overhead tracks, remnants of whatever system had been used to move materials through the building. "Look at this," Bobby said, kneeling beside a workstation near the wall. He'd found a clipboard, its metal surface rusted but still intact. The papers clipped to it had long since deteriorated into pulp, but the board itself remained. A mundane artifact from a forgotten workplace. They moved deeper into the building, finding themselves on the main processing floor. This space was vast, easily 100 feet across. Conveyor systems stretched the length of the room, their belts long rotted away, but the metal framework still intact. Stainless steel tables stood in rows, some overturned, some still in place. Industrial sinks lined one wall, their faucets frozen with rust. "This is more elaborate than a typical meat processing plant," Margaret observed. She toured agricultural facilities during her research years, studying everything from feed lots to slaughterhouses. This setup seemed wrong somehow, too clinical, too precise for what should have been a rough industrial operation. Frank noticed it too. "These walls," he said, running his hand along the concrete. "They're thicker than they need to be. And look at this." He pointed to conduits running along the ceiling. "That's high-grade electrical infrastructure, more than you'd need for basic refrigeration and conveyor systems." Diane had moved to the far end of the room, where a staircase led to the second floor. The steps were metal, still solid, and she could see offices through the doorway at the top. "I'm going to check the administrative area," she called back. "There might be records or something that explains what this place really was." "Wait," Frank said, but she was already climbing. He sighed and followed her, his protective instincts too strong to let anyone explore alone. Margaret and Bobby continued examining the processing floor, trying to piece together the purpose of each station, each piece of equipment. But the more Margaret looked, the less sense it made. The scale was wrong. The equipment was too sophisticated. And there was something else, something she couldn't quite articulate, that felt fundamentally off about this place. Bobby had wandered to the eastern wall, where a corridor led away from the main room. He shone his light down it and froze. "Margaret," he called, his voice tight, "you need to see this." She joined him at the corridor entrance. At the far end, barely visible in the dim light, was a door. Not like the other doors they'd seen, flimsy wood or rusted metal. This was a heavy steel door, institutional grade, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a secure facility. And across its surface, faded but still legible, were words stenciled in red paint. Authorized personnel only. Margaret and Bobby approached the steel door cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The walls here were different from the main processing area, smoother and more finished, as if this section had been built with different priorities in mind. The door itself was massive, easily 3 inches thick, with a handle that looked more like something from a submarine than a factory building. Frank and Diane had returned from the upstairs offices, drawn by the discovery. Frank let out a low whistle when he saw the door. "That's government-grade security," he said. "I've seen doors like this at military installations. You don't put something like that on a meat processing plant, unless you're processing something other than meat," Bobby said quietly. Diane ran her hand along the doorframe, finding the remnants of a rubber seal that had long since deteriorated. "This was airtight once," she observed. "Designed to seal completely." Margaret examined the lock mechanism. It was complex, requiring multiple keys to open. But time and rust had done their work. The door hadn't been opened in decades, and the locking mechanism had corroded. More importantly, the door stood slightly ajar, perhaps an inch of clearance. Someone had left it unsealed when they abandoned this place. "We need to think about this," Margaret said, her scientific training warring with her curiosity. "This clearly wasn't just a factory. We're looking at something that was deliberately hidden, deliberately secured. There could be reasons for that beyond simple corporate secrecy. Could be hazardous materials," Frank agreed. "Chemical storage, biological containment. We should probably report this and let professionals investigate." But Bobby had already found something that changed the equation. On the wall beside the door, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of drywall, was a metal box. He pried it open to reveal a key ring, heavy with age, but still intact. A dozen keys hung from the ring, each one labeled with a room number or designation. "Master keys," Bobby said, holding them up. "Probably belonged to the facility manager or foreman." Margaret took the ring from him, feeling the weight of them in her palm. Each key represented a locked door, a sealed room, a secret kept for over 50 years. The researcher in her, the part that had spent a lifetime pursuing knowledge, couldn't walk away from this. Whatever lay beyond that door was part of history, a story that deserved to be told. "One room," she said finally. "We open this door, we see what's immediately beyond it, and then we make an informed decision about whether to continue or report to authorities." Frank didn't look happy, but he nodded. "One room, and if there's anything hazardous, anything dangerous, we leave immediately." Margaret approached the door, selecting what looked like the most substantial key on the ring. It slid into the main lock with surprising ease, and when she turned it, she heard the click of tumblers falling into place. There were 2 other locks, both requiring different keys, and she worked through them methodically. Finally, all 3 locks disengaged. The door was heavy enough that it took both Margaret and Frank to pull it open. The hinges groaned in protest, rust flaking off as the door swung slowly inward. Beyond was darkness, absolute and complete. No windows here, no natural light. But as the door opened wider, something unexpected happened. Lights began to flicker on automatically, pale fluorescent tubes that sputtered to life after decades of dormancy. "There's still power," Diane whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "After all these years, there's still power." The lights revealed a staircase, concrete steps descending into the earth. The walls were painted institutional white, now yellowed with age. The stairs were steep and disappeared into darkness below, the lights only extending so far. At the top of the stairs, mounted on the wall, was another sign. This one was different, more official looking, with language that made Margaret's blood run cold. Warning, restricted area, clearance level 3 required, unauthorized access prohibited by federal law. Bobby read the sign aloud, his voice shaking slightly. Federal law. This wasn't just corporate. This was government. Margaret stared at the sign, her mind racing through possibilities. Federal involvement in a remote factory that supposedly processed meat. Security measures that belonged in a military installation. Power systems still functioning after 50 years of abandonment. None of it made sense, and yet all of it pointed to something far more significant than they'd imagined. "We should leave," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he could feel the pull of this mystery, the need to understand what had happened here. "Just down to the first level," Margaret said. "We see what's there, we document it with Diane's camera, and then we decide together what to do next." They descended the stairs in silence, their footsteps hollow on the concrete. The temperature dropped noticeably as they went down, and the air grew stale, heavy with the scent of old machinery, and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify. Something chemical and faintly medicinal. The stairs ended at a small landing, and beyond it stretched a corridor lined with doors. The fluorescent lights here were stronger, newer than the ones upstairs. Someone had maintained this electrical system, kept it running long after the factory above had been abandoned. That realization sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the temperature. The first door they tried opened into what looked like a storage room. Industrial shelving units lined the walls, most of them empty now, but a few still held supplies, medical supplies. Margaret recognized boxes of syringes, IV stands, monitoring equipment that looked decades old but still pristine in its packaging. Why would a meat processing plant need medical equipment? Diane asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. Bobby had moved further down the corridor, trying doors. Most were locked, but one swung open at his touch. He stepped inside, then immediately stepped back out, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. The walls were white tile, like a hospital room, and in the center sat a metal-framed bed with restraints. Leather straps hung from the bed frame, positioned where someone's wrists and ankles would be. Beside the bed stood a rolling cart with more medical equipment, monitoring devices with screens dark and dead. But it was the walls that truly disturbed Margaret. They were covered in scratches, deep gouges in the tile that had been made by something hard and desperate. Someone had been in this room, restrained on that bed, and had somehow gotten free enough to claw at the walls. The pattern of the scratches suggested years of attempts, layer upon layer of desperate markings. Frank examined the restraints without touching them. "These are police grade," he said quietly. "The kind used in psychiatric facilities or prisons. Not for animals, for people." Diane was photographing everything, her hands shaking slightly, but her professional instincts keeping her focused. Every detail captured, every angle documented. This wasn't beautiful decay anymore. This was evidence of something terrible. Margaret found a clipboard hanging on a hook near the door. Unlike the one upstairs, this one had been protected from the elements. The papers attached to it were yellowed but legible. She lifted the first page carefully, reading the typed text. Subject 23, male, age approximately 35, admitted January 15th, 1968. Treatment protocol, Series B, Phase 3. Response, minimal. Subject demonstrates continued resistance to conditioning. Recommend increased dosage. The pages continued, clinical observations written in dry, detached language. But beneath the medical terminology, Margaret could read the truth. These weren't patients. They were prisoners. And this wasn't treatment. It was experimentation. "There are more rooms," Bobby called from down the corridor. "At least a dozen more doors." Margaret felt sick. This entire basement level was designed for this, a hidden facility beneath a factory that served as cover. She thought of the families who'd lost people in the 60s and 70s, missing persons who'd never been found. How many of them had ended up here, in these white-tiled rooms, subject to experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics? "We need to see all of it," she said. her voice steady despite the horror she felt. "Every room, every document. This needs to be documented completely so these people aren't forgotten." They moved methodically through the basement, opening every door they could, photographing everything. More rooms with beds and restraints. A laboratory with equipment for testing blood and tissue samples. A storage area with filing cabinets full of records. And at the far end of the corridor, another staircase leading even deeper underground. The second staircase was narrower than the first, and the lights here were dimmer, casting long shadows that seemed to move as they descended. Margaret led the way, the master keyring heavy in her pocket. Each step taking them further from daylight and deeper into secrets that had been buried for decades. The second basement level opened into a longer corridor, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. Where the first level had felt clinical and institutional, this one felt deliberate and planned, as if someone had designed it with specific purposes in mind. The doors here were numbered, each one with a small observation window set at eye level. Frank peered through the first window and recoiled slightly. "Another room with a bed," he said. "But this one has something written on the walls." They opened the door carefully. The room was similar to the ones above, but larger, and the walls were indeed covered in writing. Not scratches this time, but words carved carefully into the paint with something sharp. Names, dates, and phrases that spoke of desperation and defiance. "John Miller was here. They can't break us. Remember who you are." Diane photographed every inch of the walls, tears streaming silently down her face. This wasn't just documentation anymore. It was bearing witness to suffering that demanded to be acknowledged. Bobby had found a nurse's station halfway down the corridor, a small desk with filing cabinets behind it. He pulled. Open drawers, systematically, finding folders organized by number rather than name. Subject 1 through Subject 47. Each folder contained medical records, psychological evaluations, and photographs. Before and after images that showed the transformation of healthy people into hollow-eyed shells. Margaret took one of the folders, forcing herself to read through it carefully. Subject 23, the same one mentioned in the clipboard upstairs. His real name had been Timothy Marsh, age 34. Picked up for vagrancy in Pittsburgh in January 1968. The file documented 3 years of experiments. Treatments that included sensory deprivation, chemical injections, psychological manipulation techniques that had no legitimate medical purpose. The final entry was dated March 12, 1971. Subject expired during treatment. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Body disposed of per protocol. They murdered him, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. They murdered all of them. Frank had found a logbook on the desk, a thick ledger with daily entries. The handwriting was neat and precise. Clinical observations recorded with the same detachment as a farmer noting livestock weights. He flipped through pages, each one detailing treatments administered, responses observed, adjustments made to protocols. This wasn't rogue, Frank said. This was systematic, organized, funded. Look at the supply requisitions. Everything came through proper channels, approved by supervisors, shipped from government warehouses. Bobby pulled out another folder, and a cracked clipboard fell from it, landing on the desk with a dull thud. Unlike the empty clipboard from upstairs, this one still held its papers intact. Intake forms, printed on government letterhead, with coded identification numbers and medical terminology that barely disguised their true purpose. Margaret picked up the clipboard, studying the forms. Each one documented the arrival of a new subject, their physical condition, their psychological state, their suitability for specific experimental protocols. The forms were stamped with approval signatures and official seals. This wasn't hidden from the government. This was the government. Project Clearwater, Bobby read from the top of one form. That's the program name. Project Clearwater, authorized under National Security Directive 47. Diane had moved further down the corridor, opening more doors, her camera clicking steadily. Each room told a similar story. Beds with restraints, monitoring equipment, walls marked by the desperate attempts of imprisoned people to leave some record of their existence. In one room, she found a makeshift calendar scratched into the wall, someone's attempt to track the passage of days that had stretched into years. Margaret forced herself to continue reading through the files, making mental notes of names and dates. These people deserved to have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged. Timothy Marsh, Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, but the coincidence of the name hit her hard. Robert Vance, which made Bobby stop and stare at the folder, wondering if there was any family connection. James O'Neill, Patricia Summers, names attached to subject numbers, lives reduced to data points in someone's experiment. At the end of the corridor, they found what appeared to be a small laboratory. Unlike the rooms they'd seen so far, this one was filled with equipment that looked more sophisticated. Microscopes, centrifuges, refrigeration units that had long since stopped working. Specimen jars lined the shelves, their contents deteriorated beyond recognition, leaving only murky residue and faded labels. Frank examined the equipment carefully, his ranger's knowledge of scientific field stations giving him context. "This is research-grade equipment," he said. "Not medical treatment. They were studying what they did to these people, analyzing the results like they were laboratory animals." Margaret found a set of research journals on a shelf, bound volumes with dates spanning from 1965 to 1971. She opened the first one, reading entries that detailed experimental protocols with the same clinical detachment as the other documents. But here, the researchers had been more honest about their goals. They weren't trying to help anyone. They were testing methods of psychological control, ways to break human will, techniques for extracting information through calculated torture. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "Subject 12 demonstrates increased susceptibility to suggestion after 72 hours of sensory deprivation combined with auditory stimulus. Recommend extending protocol to determine upper limits of conditioning effectiveness. Dr. Edmund Voigt, Principal Investigator." Bobby was searching through drawers in a desk at the back of the laboratory. He found more documents, these ones marked with higher security classifications. Budget reports showing funding that came from Department of Defense black accounts. Personnel files for the staff who'd worked here, doctors and nurses and technicians who'd participated in these experiments. Most of the names meant nothing to him, but a few he recognized from his historical research. Respected physicians, some of whom had gone on to distinguished careers after this facility closed. "They got away with it," Bobby said, anger clear in his voice. "All these people, the ones who did this, they just moved on to other positions. Some of them became department heads at universities, medical directors at hospitals. They were never held accountable." Diane had stopped taking pictures. She sat on the floor in the corner, her camera in her lap, staring at nothing. The weight of what they'd discovered was crushing. The accumulated horror of room after room, file after file. Evidence of systematic cruelty perpetrated by people who'd taken oaths to do no harm. Margaret sat down beside her, not speaking, just being present. Sometimes there were no words adequate to the moment, no comfort that could diminish the magnitude of human cruelty. They sat together in silence, two women of an age to remember when this had been happening, when these crimes were being committed in secret while the world went about its business. Frank and Bobby continued searching, driven by the need to understand the full scope of what had happened here. They found procurement records showing deliveries of chemicals and drugs, some of them experimental compounds that had never been approved for human use. They found correspondence between the facility director and supervisors in Washington, bureaucratic memos discussing budgets and timelines with the casual indifference of people planning any other government program. And then Bobby found something that changed everything. A memo dated February 28, 1971, marked urgent and confidential. He read it quickly, then read it again to make sure he understood correctly. "They knew it was ending," he called to the others. "Listen to this. Congressional Oversight Committee asking questions. Media beginning to investigate similar programs. Directive from above to cease operations and sanitize all facilities. All subjects to be terminated. All records to be destroyed. Facility to be abandoned and sealed. Effective March 15th, 1971. Margaret stood up, taking the memo from Bobby. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. They hadn't closed this facility because the research was complete or because they'd had a crisis of conscience. They'd closed it because they were about to be exposed, and they'd covered their tracks by murdering everyone who could testify to what had happened here. The final entries in the subject files, Margaret said slowly, they all end in March 1971. Cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, complications from treatment. But they weren't complications. They were executions. Frank's hands had clenched into fists. 47 subjects, according to those files. 47 people murdered to protect this secret. And then they sealed the basement and walked away, Bobby added. Let the forest reclaim the building. Let everyone forget this place existed. But someone hadn't forgotten. The power was still on. The lights still worked, which meant someone had been here, maintaining the systems, keeping the evidence intact. The question was why. Margaret walked to the electrical panel on the laboratory wall, examining it closely. The panel was new, or at least newer than everything else in this basement. Modern circuit breakers, updated wiring, a digital meter showing active power flow. Someone had retrofitted this entire level with contemporary electrical systems, and recently enough that the equipment still looked clean. This can't be more than 5 or 10 years old, she said, running her finger along the panel's edge. Someone has been maintaining this place, keeping it operational. The realization shifted something in the atmosphere. They were no longer exploring an abandoned building. They were potentially trespassing in an active facility, one that someone cared enough about to maintain. The question of who and why suddenly became urgent. Frank moved to the staircase, listening for any sounds from above. We should consider leaving, he said. Document what we've found, contact the authorities, let them investigate properly. But Bobby had discovered something else, a door at the back of the laboratory that they'd initially missed. It was smaller than the others, almost hidden behind a filing cabinet that had been moved at some point. The door was locked, but one of the keys on the master ring fit. Beyond the door was a staircase, this one leading down to a 3rd level. The stairs were newer than the others, concrete but with modern construction techniques. And at the bottom, they could see light, not the flickering fluorescence of the levels above, but steady LED illumination. There's another level, Bobby said, his voice a mixture of dread and fascination. And it's active. They stood at the top of the stairs, each of them wrestling with the decision. Everything they'd found so far was historical, terrible, but contained in the past. Going down to a 3rd level, one that was clearly being used currently, crossed a line from documentation to direct interference with whatever was happening here. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. As the group's unofficial leader, the decision fell to her. They could leave now, report what they'd found, and let others handle it. That would be safe, reasonable, responsible. But it would also mean walking away from answers that might explain who was maintaining this place and why. If there's a 3rd level that's active, she said slowly, then there might be people down there who need help. Or there might be evidence that explains what's happening now, not just what happened 50 years ago. Or there might be people down there who really don't want us finding this place, Frank countered. People with resources and motivation to keep this secret. Diane had been quiet, but now she spoke up. We've already seen too much to just walk away. If we leave now and report this, what happens? Local police come out, probably don't have jurisdiction over federal property. It gets kicked up to state authorities, maybe federal agents. And in the time it takes to organize all that, whoever is maintaining this place has plenty of warning to clean up or disappear. She stood up, picking up her camera. We document everything on this 3rd level. We make sure there's a record that can't be erased. Then we leave and we make sure the right people see what we found. Bobby nodded in agreement. If we're careful, if we're quiet, we can see what's down there without being detected. Just reconnaissance." Frank looked at each of them, seeing the determination in their faces. He'd spent 30 years trying to keep people safe in the wilderness, and every instinct told him this was dangerous. But he also understood the principle they were following. Some things were more important than personal safety. Some truths needed to be witnessed, all right, he said finally. But we move carefully. No unnecessary risks. At the first sign of danger, we retreat. Agreed? They all nodded, and together they descended the third staircase. The temperature dropped even further as they went down, and the air quality changed. It was cleaner down here, filtered and climate-controlled. The walls were painted a soft grey, and the lighting was professional grade. This wasn't a relic from the 1970s. This was a modern facility, built within or beneath the old one. The stairs opened into a small vestibule with a single door. The door had a card reader beside it, but it also had a traditional lock, and once again, the master keyring provided access. Margaret unlocked it carefully, and Frank pulled the door open slowly, ready to close it quickly if needed. Beyond was a sight that took their breath away. The third level was nothing like the horror chambers above. It was an archive, a vast underground library dedicated to preserving the evidence they'd been discovering. Row upon row of floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched into the distance, each one filled with labeled boxes. The lighting was perfect, the temperature and humidity carefully controlled to preserve documents and materials. Digital workstations sat at intervals throughout the space, their screens dark but clearly functional. Margaret stepped into the room slowly, overwhelmed by the scope of what she was seeing. This wasn't a cover-up. This was preservation on a massive scale. Someone had taken everything from Project Clearwater and organized it, catalogued it, maintained it with the care typically reserved for national treasures. The boxes on the nearest shelf were labeled with project names. Project Clearwater occupied dozens of boxes, but it was far from alone. Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird, Project MK Ultra, Project Midnight Climax. Names that Margaret vaguely recognized from conspiracy theories and declassified documents, programs that the government had reluctantly acknowledged decades after the fact. But here they were, fully documented, every file and photograph and memo preserved. Bobby moved along the shelves, reading labels in a daze. "This is everything," he whispered. "Every illegal program, every unethical experiment, every crime committed in the name of national security. It's all here." Frank found a workstation and touched the mouse, bringing the screen to life. It didn't require a password, which suggested whoever maintained this place wasn't worried about unauthorized access. The screen displayed a database interface with thousands of entries, each one representing a document or file or piece of evidence. He clicked on the Clearwater folder and found himself looking at a complete digital archive of everything they'd seen upstairs, plus much more. "There are personnel files here for everyone who worked on these programs," Frank said, scrolling through the database. "Not just the facility staff, but the supervisors in Washington, the politicians who authorized the funding, the military officers who provided subjects. Complete documentation of the chain of command." Diane had found something that made her stop cold. A climate-controlled display case, like something you'd see in a museum, containing a single glass vial. The label read, "Project Clearwater, Compound Series B, Original Sample. March 1971. This was the serum they'd used on the subjects. The chemical that had broken minds and destroyed lives. Preserved here like a holy relic. Margaret joined her at the display case, studying the vial. Inside the clear glass was a pale blue liquid, innocuous in appearance but representing years of suffering. Someone had kept this, not as evidence for prosecution but as a historical artifact, a physical reminder of what had been done. "Why?" Diane asked. "Why preserve all of this if not to use it?" The answer came from behind them, a woman's voice, calm and measured. "Because evidence that's destroyed can never bring justice, and evidence that's released prematurely is often destroyed before it can." They spun around to find a woman in her 60s standing near the entrance they'd come through. She wore slacks and a cardigan, looking more like a librarian than a security guard. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried no visible weapons. Behind her stood 4 others, younger, dressed in dark clothing that suggested security personnel, but moving with casual confidence rather than aggression. "Please don't be alarmed," the woman said. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Director of the Institute for Historical Transparency. You're not in danger, though I must admit, we didn't expect anyone to find this place, much less make it down to this level." Margaret found her voice first. "You've been maintaining this facility, keeping the power on, preserving the evidence. For the past 30 years, yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "We acquired the Clearwater site in 1992 after the Cold War ended, and certain files began to be declassified. We've been systematically documenting programs like this ever since, creating a permanent record that can't be buried or destroyed. But you haven't released any of it," Bobby said, anger creeping into his voice. "People deserve to know what was done here. Families deserve answers about their missing loved ones." Dr. Chen's expression was sympathetic, but firm. "We've tried premature disclosure before. Do you know what happened when MKUltra was exposed in the 1970s? The CIA destroyed most of the evidence. Witnesses disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. No one was prosecuted. The crimes were acknowledged, but never punished, and most of the evidence was lost forever." She gestured to the archives around them. "This facility contains documentation of 47 people who were murdered in the name of national security. But it also contains evidence of hundreds of other victims from dozens of other programs. Evidence that would be destroyed immediately if we released it now. While the people responsible still have power and influence." Frank stepped forward. His protective instincts focused now on understanding the threat level. "So what happens to us? We stumbled onto your operation. Are you going to let us leave?" Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "You're not prisoners, Mr. Donovan, though I should mention we've been monitoring your progress through the facility since you entered. We have cameras throughout the building, including the levels you explored." She gestured to one of her security team, who pulled up footage on a tablet. Margaret watched herself and her friends moving through the basement levels, opening doors, reading files, their horror and anger visible even in the grainy surveillance footage. "We knew you'd found the factory about an hour after you arrived," Dr. Chen continued. "We watched you explore, and we made the decision to let you continue. You were careful, respectful, and clearly motivated by a desire to understand rather than exploit. Those qualities are rare." Bobby was studying Dr. Chen with the intensity of a historian evaluating a primary source. "The Institute for Historical Transparency. I've never heard of it. That's intentional. We operate through front organizations funded by anonymous donors who believe in eventual accountability. Some of them are former intelligence officers who developed consciences late in their careers. Others are family members of victims who want the truth preserved, even if they won't live to see justice." She walked to one of the workstations and pulled up a file. "We have 17 facilities like this one, scattered across the country, each one dedicated to preserving evidence of government programs that violated human rights, constitutional protections, or international law. We employ former CIA historians, retired military officers, archivists, and researchers, people who know how to evaluate evidence and protect it from destruction." Margaret moved closer to examine the file on the screen. It showed a network of locations, each one with a brief description. A former psychiatric hospital in upstate New York, documenting illegal drug testing on mental patients. An abandoned military base in Nevada, preserving evidence of radiation experiments on unwitting civilians. A shuttered prison in Louisiana, cataloging decades of medical experimentation on inmates. "This is massive," Margaret breathed. "You're documenting systematic abuse spanning decades." "Longer than that," Dr. Chen said. "Some of our archives go back to World War II. Operation Paperclip, where we brought Nazi scientists to America and let them continue their work. Human radiation experiments during the Cold War, biological weapons testing on American cities. Every program that was too controversial to acknowledge, too criminal to defend, we document it. Diane had been quiet, but now she spoke up, her voice tight with emotion. But documentation without disclosure is just another form of cover-up. You're protecting the guilty by keeping this secret. We're protecting the evidence, Dr. Chen corrected gently. There's a difference. If we released everything tomorrow, what would happen? The news cycle would cover it for a week, maybe two. There would be congressional hearings where everyone expresses outrage but takes no action. The people responsible would deny, deflect, and die of old age before any trials began. And in the chaos of disclosure, evidence would disappear. Witnesses would be discredited or silenced. And in 10 years, scholars would debate whether it really happened at all. She moved to the display case containing the vial, placing her hand on the glass. This serum represents 3 years of experiments on Timothy Marsh. It killed him eventually, but not before it destroyed his personality, his memories, his sense of self. If we release this evidence now, someone will claim the vial is fake, that we manufactured it for publicity. But if we wait until everyone involved is dead, until there's no one left to protect, then we can release everything with legal and historical documentation that can't be refuted. Frank crossed his arms. How long are you planning to wait? It varies by program. For Clearwater, most of the directly responsible parties are already dead. The facility director, Dr. Edmund Voigt, died in 1998. The CIA supervisor who authorized the program died in 2003. We're now in the process of identifying the next level up. The politicians and military leaders who provided funding and political cover. Bobby was shaking his head. So you wait until everyone is safely dead. Then you release evidence that can't result in prosecutions. That's not justice. That's historical record-keeping. It's the only form of justice that's possible, Dr. Chen replied. Because the alternative is what happened with MKUltra and dozens of other programs. A brief scandal, some destroyed evidence, no convictions, and the historical record permanently incomplete. At least our way, the truth eventually comes out in its entirety. Margaret understood the logic, even as she hated it. Dr. Chen was right that premature disclosure often resulted in evidence destruction. But she was also advocating for a form of justice so delayed it became almost meaningless. What about the families? Diane asked, her voice breaking slightly. Timothy Marsh had a sister. We saw her name in the files upstairs. She's probably still alive, wondering what happened to her brother. Doesn't she deserve to know? Dr. Chen's expression softened. We've identified families for 32 of the 47 Clearwater victims. Some of them we've quietly contacted, providing closure without full disclosure. Others we're monitoring, waiting for the right moment. Timothy Marsh's sister, Helen, is 78 years old. She lives in Philadelphia. We have a file ready to give her when the time comes. When the time comes, Bobby repeated bitterly. You mean when she's about to die, so the truth dies with her too? No, Dr. Chen said firmly. I mean when we can give her the truth without endangering the historical record. When we can ensure that her brother's suffering is acknowledged publicly, not just privately. When his murderers can be named without the risk of evidence destruction. She pulled up another file, this one showing a timeline. Clearwater is scheduled for Phase 1 disclosure in 18 months. That means families will be contacted, victims will be named, and the basic facts will be released to academic historians. Full public disclosure, including all documentation and a digital archive, is scheduled for 2028. That's when the last of the mid-level supervisors will be dead or incapacitated. Margaret studied the timeline, seeing the careful planning behind it. Every step was calculated to maximize historical accuracy, while minimizing the risk of evidence loss. It was methodical, strategic, and deeply frustrating to anyone who wanted immediate justice. You're asking us to become part of this, Margaret said slowly. To keep your secret, to wait years for disclosure that might never happen. I'm asking you to consider the consequences of premature exposure, Dr. Chen replied. You found this place by accident, but that doesn't give you the right to destroy decades of careful preservation work. If you go to the authorities tomorrow, what happens? Local police investigate, find nothing because we'll have moved the archives overnight. State police get involved, jurisdictional disputes delay everything. Eventually, federal agents arrive, and they're the very people whose agencies we're documenting. Evidence disappears. Witnesses develop amnesia, and in 6 months, this facility is just another abandoned building with a few conspiracy theories attached. Frank had been watching the security personnel, noting their positions, their body language. They weren't threatening, but they were clearly prepared to prevent the group from leaving if necessary. So what are you offering? Besides letting us walk out of here alive? Partnership, Dr. Chen said. The Institute has always been run by people with government or intelligence backgrounds. We're good at preservation and security, but we lack outside perspective. We've become too comfortable with delayed justice, too accepting of strategic timelines. We need people who still believe in immediate accountability, who can push us to move faster without being reckless. She gestured to the 4 hikers. You're a biologist, a former ranger, a photographer, and a historian. Each of you brings skills and perspectives we need. Join our ethics board. Help us decide when disclosure is appropriate. Challenge our assumptions. Make sure we're working toward justice, not just historical completeness. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and complex. They'd come here expecting to find an abandoned building, maybe some interesting history. Instead, they discovered evidence of crimes that demanded justice. And now, they were being asked to join the very organization that was delaying that justice. Margaret looked at her companions, seeing the conflict in their faces. Frank's jaw was tight with anger, but his eyes showed calculation. He understood strategic thinking, knew that sometimes the best outcome required patience. Diane was crying quietly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering they'd witnessed. Bobby was staring at the archives, his historian's mind clearly racing through implications. We need time to discuss this, Margaret said finally. Among ourselves, without you listening, Dr. Chen nodded. Of course, take all the time you need. My team and I will wait upstairs. But understand, whatever you decide, you can't unknow what you've learned here. That burden is yours now, regardless of what choice you make. She turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Those files you photographed, the documents you saw upstairs, we have digital copies. If something happens to us, if this facility is destroyed, the evidence still exists in multiple secure locations. Your choice isn't between disclosure and destruction. It's between strategic release and chaotic exposure. Dr. Chen and her team left, their footsteps echoing up the stairwell. The 4 hikers stood alone in the archive, surrounded by the documented suffering of hundreds of victims. Faced with an impossible choice, they stood in silence for a long moment after Dr. Chen left, each of them processing what they'd heard and what they'd been offered. Margaret walked slowly through the archives, running her hand along the shelves, feeling the weight of all these preserved secrets. Somewhere in these boxes were answers that families had been seeking for decades, truths that had been buried and forgotten. Frank broke the silence first. This is manipulation. She's trying to make us complicit in keeping these secrets. Maybe, Bobby said. But she's also right about what happens with premature disclosure. I've researched enough historical cover-ups to know the pattern. Evidence gets destroyed, witnesses disappear, and the truth becomes disputed history instead of documented fact. Diane had moved to one of the workstations and was clicking through files, her photographer's eye drawn to the visual evidence. Look at this, she said quietly. The screen showed photographs from the 1960s, before and after images of Clearwater subjects. The transformation was devastating. Healthy people reduced to hollow shells in a matter of months. There are hundreds of these, Diane continued, scrolling through the database. Every program, every facility, fully documented with photographs and testimony. If this gets released carelessly, half of it will be dismissed as fake or exaggerated. Margaret joined her at the workstation, and that's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of the screen, barely visible, was a live camera feed. Multiple feeds, actually, showing various angles of the archive room. And in one of them, she could clearly see herself and her three friends standing exactly where they were now. But there was something else in that feed, something that didn't belong. In the background, partially hidden behind a shelf unit, was equipment that hadn't been there a moment ago. A tripod with a professional camera, its lens pointed at them. "Bobby," Margaret said carefully, keeping her voice level. "Do you still have your phone?" He pulled it out. "Yeah, why?" "Check your photos. The ones you took upstairs." Bobby scrolled through his photo gallery, and his face went pale. "They're gone. All of them. Every photo I took has been deleted." Frank immediately checked his phone. Then Diane checked hers. Same result. Every photograph they'd taken since entering the facility had been remotely wiped from their devices. "The camera," Diane said suddenly, moving toward the equipment Margaret had spotted. She lifted it from the tripod, examining it with professional familiarity. "This is mine. This is my backup camera from my car." The realization hit them all simultaneously. Dr. Chen's team hadn't just been monitoring them through the facility. They'd been in their vehicles, going through their equipment, preparing for this exact scenario. Margaret's hands were shaking as she turned the camera on and checked its memory card. The photos were all there, every image Diane had taken. But there were also new photos, ones Diane hadn't taken. Images of the four of them entering the facility, time-stamped from this morning. Photos of them hiking on the trail, taken from concealed positions in the forest. Someone had been following them since they left the trailhead, documenting their every move. "They knew we were coming," Margaret said, her voice tight. "This wasn't a chance discovery they allowed to continue. They expected us." Frank was already moving toward the stairs, his protective instincts fully engaged. "We need to leave, now." But when they reached the stairwell door, it wouldn't open. The electronic lock had engaged, sealing them in. Frank tried the master key ring, but none of the old keys worked on modern electronic locks. Bobby was back at the workstation, frantically searching through files. "There's something else here," he said. "A folder labeled Legacy Phase. It's dated from 2 weeks ago." He opened it, and what they found changed everything they thought they understood about the Institute. The files detailed a plan, not for disclosure, but for recruitment. The Institute had identified them weeks earlier, researched their backgrounds, and determined they would be suitable candidates for expansion of the Ethics Board. The overgrown logging road had been carefully maintained to be just visible enough to attract curious hikers. The factory had been staged to look abandoned while actually being fully monitored. "We were brought here," Diane said, horror dawning in her voice. "This whole thing was orchestrated." Margaret found an email thread that confirmed it. Dr. Chen had written to her board 2 weeks earlier, discussing their need for outside perspectives, specifically targeting people with scientific backgrounds, ethical concerns, and no political connections that would compromise their independence. The email mentioned Margaret by name, noting her retirement from the university and her regular hiking habits in the region. "They've been watching us for weeks," Margaret said. "Studying us, manipulating us, leading us here like laboratory rats." The intercom crackled to life, and Dr. Chen's voice filled the archive room. "I'm sorry you found that folder. We'd planned to disclose our recruitment methods eventually, but not quite so soon. You have to understand, we couldn't simply approach you directly. You needed to discover this place organically, to feel the weight of these secrets firsthand. Otherwise, you'd never truly commit to the work," Frank shouted at the nearest camera. "No, let us out, now." "I will," Dr. Chen replied calmly. "But first, let me show you one more thing. Something that will help you understand why we do what we do, and why we need people like you." The lights in the archive dimmed, and one of the large display screens on the wall came to life. Dr. Chen's face appeared, But she wasn't speaking directly to them anymore. Instead, they were watching a recording, something she'd prepared in advance for this exact moment. "If you're watching this," the recorded Dr. Chen said, "then you've discovered our recruitment methods, and you're rightfully angry. I don't blame you. What we did was manipulative, a violation of your autonomy and trust. But I need you to understand why we did it, and more importantly, what's at stake if we fail." The screen changed to show a map of the United States, with dozens of locations marked in red. "These are facilities like Clearwater, not the 17 we're currently preserving, but the ones we know existed and were completely destroyed before we could secure them. Every red dot represents thousands of pages of evidence that no longer exists, hundreds of victims whose stories will never be told, and dozens of perpetrators who escaped accountability." Frank was still trying the door, testing its strength, looking for any weakness. Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes. He was former military, she realized, not just a park ranger. His movements were too practiced, too tactical. He'd mentioned training from before, and now she understood what that meant. The recording continued. "In 1995, we tried conventional recruitment. We approached historians, journalists, and activists directly, explained our mission, and asked for their help. Do you know what happened? 3 of them immediately went public, exposing our existence before we could secure vulnerable evidence. 2 facilities were raided and destroyed within days. One of our researchers was found dead in an apparent suicide that was anything but. We lost 5 years of work and the historical record of 2 major programs. Bobby had pulled up a different file on the workstation, this one showing detailed dossiers on each of them. Margaret's file included her published research, her teaching evaluations, even notes from her divorce proceedings 20 years earlier. They knew everything about her, had mapped out her entire life, looking for leverage points and vulnerabilities. "So we changed our approach," Dr. Chen's recording explained. "We realized that people who discover evidence organically, who feel the weight of these secrets personally, are far more likely to understand the complexity of our mission. Yes, it's manipulation, but it's manipulation in service of a goal I believe you share, ensuring these crimes are never forgotten." Diane had found something else on her camera, buried in the metadata of the photos taken of them on the trail. GPS coordinates, timestamps, and notes. They'd been tracked from the moment they entered the state forest, their progress monitored and guided. The overgrown logging road they'd found hadn't been an accident. It had been the only route clearly maintained, deliberately made visible to curious hikers, while all other paths were thoroughly obscured. "Here's what I'm offering," the recorded Dr. Chen said. "Full transparency from this point forward. Access to all our files, including the ones about your recruitment. Genuine partnership in deciding disclosure timelines. And most importantly, the knowledge that you're helping prevent what happened after MKUltra from happening again." The screen changed again, this time showing a weathered tunnel map, laminated and marked with dates and annotations. Margaret recognized it immediately as far older than the modern facility, dating back to the original 1971 closure. The map showed an extensive tunnel system connecting not just the factory to other locations, but including an emergency exit that led to a service road 2 miles away. "That map is hanging on the wall behind the filing cabinet to your left," Dr. Chen's voice said. "It's the original map from 1971, used by the staff when they evacuated and sealed the facility. The tunnels still exist, and they're not electronically locked. If you want to leave right now, you can follow the main tunnel northeast for 2 miles. It will bring you to an old Forest Service road where your vehicles have been moved." Frank had already found the map, pulling it from the wall. He studied it carefully, his finger tracing the tunnel route. "This could be another trap," he said. "It could be," Margaret agreed. "But she's right about one thing. We can't unknow what we've learned. Whether we join them or expose them, we're part of this now," the recording concluded. "Take the tunnel, go home. Think about what you've seen and what it means. In 48 hours, I'll send you coordinates for a meeting place where we can discuss this as equals, not as captors and prisoners. But know this, If you choose to expose us, you'll be destroying the life's work of people who genuinely believe they're preventing historical crimes from being forgotten. That's your right. But make sure it's the choice you want to live with. The door lock clicked open. They were free to leave. They didn't discuss it. Frank simply folded the tunnel map, tucked it into his jacket, and headed for the door. The others followed, moving through the archive one last time. Margaret paused at the display case containing the glass vial, that pale blue serum that had destroyed Timothy Marsh and 46 others. She placed her hand on the glass, feeling the cool surface, and made a silent promise to those victims that their suffering wouldn't be forgotten, regardless of what choice she ultimately made. The tunnel entrance was exactly where the map indicated, behind a section of shelving that swung away on hidden hinges. Beyond was a narrow passage, concrete-lined and lit by emergency lighting that clicked on automatically as they entered. The air was stale but breathable, and the tunnel stretched into darkness ahead of them. They walked in silence, single file, with Frank leading and checking the map periodically. The tunnel was longer than Margaret had anticipated, and the steady downward slope told her they were going deeper before they could eventually rise toward the surface exit. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a rhythmic sound that echoed off the concrete walls. After what felt like a mile, they reached a junction. The main tunnel continued northeast toward their promised exit, but a side passage branched off to the west. The map showed this passage leading to what was labeled as a disposal area, the same one they'd briefly glimpsed earlier. Bobby stopped at the junction, staring down the side passage. "We should look," he said quietly. "If we're going to make a decision about the Institute, we need to see everything, not just what they chose to show us." Frank shook his head. "We've seen enough. More than enough, have we?" Bobby challenged. "We've seen files and photographs. We've seen rooms where terrible things happened. But we haven't seen where they disposed of the bodies. We haven't seen the final evidence of what they did." Margaret understood his reasoning. The historian in him needed complete documentation, needed to bear witness to the full scope of the crimes. But she also understood Frank's reluctance. There were some things that, once seen, could never be unseen. 10 minutes, she decided. We look, we document it in our memories, and then we continue to the exit. The side tunnel was shorter, ending at a large chamber that had been carved from the natural rock. The space was dominated by an industrial incinerator, massive and cold, its metal surface rusted but still intact. Beside it stood barrels of chemicals, their labels faded but their purpose clear. This was where they destroyed the evidence of their crimes, burning bodies and dissolving remains until nothing identifiable remained, but someone had left a memorial. Scratched into the concrete wall near the incinerator were names, 23 of them, carved with what looked like a piece of rebar. Margaret recognized some from the files they'd seen. Timothy Marsh, Sarah Chen, Robert Vance, names that should have been forgotten but had been preserved by someone who'd worked here, someone who'd kept a record even as they participated in destroying the evidence. Diane photographed the wall with her phone, capturing every name. "Someone who worked here had a conscience," she said. Someone tried to remember them. Bobby was examining the names closely, and suddenly he stopped, his hand trembling as he pointed to one entry. "Robert Vance, the same name as his own. This can't be coincidence," he whispered. "Dr. Chen said they researched us thoroughly. They knew I'd see this name. They knew what it would do to me." Margaret felt the manipulation like a physical weight. Every detail of their experience had been calculated, designed to create maximum emotional impact. The names on the wall might be real, the victims certainly existed, but the Institute had known exactly how these discoveries would affect each of them personally. "We need to leave," Frank said firmly. "Right now, before they spring whatever else they have planned." They returned to the main tunnel and continued northeast, moving faster now, driven by a mixture of anger and fear. The tunnel began to slope upward after another half-mile, and the air grew fresher. They could smell earth and pine, signs that they were approaching the surface. The exit was sealed with a heavy door, but it opened from the inside with a simple push bar. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight, blinking against the brightness after hours underground. They were in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest, and sure enough, their vehicles were parked on an old service road, exactly as Dr. Chen had promised. But there was something else. Sitting on the hood of Margaret's car was an envelope, thick and official-looking. Frank opened it carefully, finding a letter and a small device that looked like a secure USB drive. The letter was handwritten in elegant script. "You've seen what we preserve. Now see what we've already released." The USB drive was labeled with a single word, proof. They had 48 hours to decide, and the weight of that decision felt heavier than ever. 6 months had passed since that October afternoon when 4 hikers stumbled upon a secret that changed their lives forever. Margaret sat in a conference room at the Institute's headquarters, no longer hidden underground, but occupying a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia. The USB drive Dr. Chen had left them contained proof of the Institute's previous disclosures, carefully orchestrated releases of historical evidence that had led to acknowledgements, apologies, and in a few cases, actual policy changes. It wasn't the immediate justice they'd wanted, but it was something. The decision to join had been Margaret's, made after 3 sleepless nights reviewing everything they'd seen. Frank had argued against it initially, but eventually agreed when Margaret pointed out that working from inside gave them more power to push for faster disclosure than criticizing from outside. Diane had been the easiest to convince. She'd already started organizing the photographs for what would eventually become a public exhibition. Bobby had been the last, wrestling with the discovery that a Robert Vance had died in Clearwater, possibly a distant relative he'd never known existed. Now they sat together at a polished table, reviewing the case file for Timothy Marsh. His sister Helen was 79 now, living in a nursing home in Philadelphia. The Institute had prepared a complete dossier on her brother's disappearance, his time at Clearwater, and his death. Today was the day they would deliver it to her. The first step in the disclosure process they'd fought to accelerate. Margaret held Timothy Marsh's wallet, recovered from the archives and carefully preserved as evidence. It would be returned to Helen, along with the documentation, a tangible piece of her brother that had been kept from her for over 50 years. Inside were photos of a young woman who must have been Helen herself, a driver's license with Timothy's hopeful smile, and a folded note that read simply, "Remember who you are." The same words they'd seen scratched on the wall in his cell. Dr. Chen entered the room, and the dynamic between them had shifted over these months. They were no longer captor and prisoners, but neither were they quite equals. Margaret and her friends had become the conscience of the Institute, pushing boundaries and demanding faster timelines. Dr. Chen had resisted at first, but gradually began to see the value in their urgency. "Helen Marsh is expecting us at 2 o'clock, Dr. Chen said. "Margaret, you'll lead the conversation. Bobby will provide the historical context. Diane has agreed to give Helen copies of the photographs for her personal records. Frank will handle any questions about official procedures." They drove to Philadelphia together, carrying boxes of evidence that represented 3 years of Timothy Marsh's stolen life. Helen Marsh was waiting for them in her small room, a woman whose face still held traces of the girl in Timothy's wallet photo. She'd been waiting for answers for 54 years. Margaret sat beside her and began to speak, telling the story they'd uncovered in that abandoned factory. Helen cried quietly as she held her brother's wallet, running her fingers over the photos she'd assumed were lost forever. When Margaret finished, Helen looked at each of them and said simply, "Thank you for not forgetting him." They returned to their cars as evening fell, and Margaret realized something had shifted. They hadn't gotten the immediate justice they'd wanted when they first discovered Clearwater. They'd become part of a slower process, one that measured success in decades rather than days. But they'd also ensured that Timothy Marsh and 46 others would be remembered, that their suffering would be acknowledged, that history would record what had been done to them. Frank drove them back toward the mountains. Toward the trails they still hiked together. They talked about ordinary things now, grandchildren and retirement hobbies, and plans for next spring. But underneath, they carried the weight of secrets they'd chosen to protect until the time was right to release them. Margaret pulled out her trail journal that evening and made an entry, not about the hike that had started all this, but about the journey they were still on. Some truths took time to tell properly, she wrote. Some justice required patience, and some secrets were worth keeping. If keeping them meant they would eventually be heard. Margaret couldn't sleep that first night after leaving the facility. She lay in her bed at home, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day. The USB drive sat on her nightstand, still unexamined. Part of her was afraid to look at it, afraid that whatever proof Dr. Chen had provided would make the decision easier or harder. She wasn't sure which. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and carried the drive downstairs to her study. The room was lined with shelves holding her field journals, 47 of them now, each one documenting a journey into the natural world. But the journey they'd taken that day had been into something far darker than any wilderness she'd ever explored. She plugged the drive into her computer and opened the files. What she found was meticulous documentation of 3 previous disclosure operations the Institute had conducted. The first was a program from the 1950s involving radiation experiments on pregnant women. The Institute had spent 12 years gathering evidence, identifying victims' families, and preparing legal documentation. When they finally released the information, it had led to a congressional apology, a compensation fund for survivors, and changes to medical ethics protocols. The second case involved illegal surveillance of civil rights leaders in the 1960s. The Institute's evidence had been instrumental in forcing the FBI to acknowledge the full scope of COINTELPRO operations. Families had received apologies. Historical records had been corrected. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense, but it was acknowledgement that these crimes had occurred. The third case was still ongoing. A program from the 1980s that the Institute was carefully preparing to expose. Margaret could see the timeline. The strategic decisions about when to contact families, when to approach journalists, when to release specific documents to maximize impact while minimizing the risk of evidence destruction. Dr. Chen was right about one thing. The Institute's method worked. Slow, strategic disclosure achieved results that immediate exposure rarely did. But it also meant that justice was delayed for decades, that victims and their families waited years for answers that could have been provided sooner. Margaret heard a knock at her door just after dawn. She opened it to find Frank standing on her porch, looking as tired as she felt. He held up his own copy of the USB drive. Couldn't sleep either, he said. They sat at her kitchen table, drinking coffee and talking through what they'd seen. Frank had a perspective she lacked, having worked in law enforcement for years before becoming a park ranger. He understood the frustration of watching guilty people escape prosecution due to destroyed evidence or intimidated witnesses. The Institute's approach makes sense from a preservation standpoint, Frank admitted. But it feels wrong. We have evidence of murder, and we're being asked to sit on it for months or years while they decide the optimal disclosure timeline. What's the alternative? Margaret asked. We go to the police today, and what happens? The local sheriff's department isn't equipped to investigate federal crimes from 50 years ago. It gets kicked up to state police, then federal authorities. And those federal authorities might include people whose agencies we're trying to expose. Frank nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. Dr. Chen mentioned that 3 of their previous recruitment attempts went straight to the media and destroyed years of work. But what if we're different? What if we can push them to move faster, without blowing everything up? Margaret considered this. You're suggesting we join them, but as antagonists, not allies. We become the voice for immediate justice, pushing against their instinct for delayed disclosure. Exactly. They need outside perspective. They said so themselves. So we give them perspective that makes them uncomfortable, that forces them to justify every delay. It made sense strategically. Working from inside the institute would give them access to all the evidence, all the cases, and some influence over disclosure timelines. Fighting from outside would likely result in nothing but their own frustration and possible legal consequences. Margaret pulled out her phone and called Bobby, then Diane. Within an hour, all four of them were sitting in her kitchen, the USB drive's contents displayed on her laptop. They talked for hours, weighing options, considering consequences, trying to find a path that honored both the victims who deserved immediate acknowledgement and the need to protect evidence from destruction. By noon, they'd reached a consensus. They would accept Dr. Chen's invitation, but on their terms. They would join the Institute's ethics board with the explicit mandate to challenge every delayed disclosure, to advocate for victims' families, and to push for the fastest possible timelines consistent with protecting the evidence. Margaret composed an email to Dr. Chen outlining their conditions. They wanted full access to all files, participation in all disclosure decisions, and the right to advocate publicly for faster timelines without being bound by the Institute's preference for secrecy. She hit send and waited for a response. Dr. Chen's response came within 2 hours. She proposed a meeting at a neutral location, a state park lodge, 2 hours south of where they'd discovered the factory. Margaret recognized the choice as strategic. Public enough to feel safe, remote enough to avoid casual eavesdropping. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, giving them time to prepare, but not enough time to overthink their decision. They arrived separately, each taking their own vehicle as a precaution, none of them articulated, but all understood. The lodge was nearly empty on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, just a few hikers stopping for coffee before heading back to the trails. Margaret spotted Dr. Chen immediately, sitting at a corner table with a leather portfolio in front of her. Dr. Chen stood as they approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming. And thank you for your email. Your conditions are reasonable, though I'll admit they'll make our work more complicated." "That's the point," Frank said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "You said you needed outside perspective. We're providing it." Dr. Chen opened her portfolio and withdrew a document. "I've prepared a formal agreement outlining the terms you requested. Full access to all Institute files and archives. Participation in disclosure decisions with voting rights on the ethics board. And the freedom to advocate for positions contrary to Institute recommendations within certain constraints." "What constraints?" Bobby asked immediately. "You can't unilaterally disclose classified information without board approval. You can't contact victims' families without coordination with our legal team. And you can't reveal the Institute's existence or locations without unanimous board consent. These constraints exist to protect the evidence, not to silence you." Margaret read through the document carefully. It was surprisingly thorough, addressing concerns she hadn't even thought to raise. The Ethics Board would meet monthly to review active cases and vote on disclosure timelines. Any board member could propose accelerating a timeline, and the proposal would be debated and voted upon. The Institute would provide resources for independent verification of evidence, ensuring the board wasn't simply accepting the staff's analysis. "Who else is on this ethics board?" Diane asked. Dr. Chen pulled out another document, this one listing 12 names. Margaret recognized several from academic circles, respected historians and ethicists who'd built careers studying government accountability. Others were unfamiliar, but their credentials were impressive. A former federal judge, an investigative journalist who'd broken several major stories about intelligence agency misconduct, a psychologist specializing in trauma and recovery. "You four would bring the board to 16 members, Dr. Chen explained. "We prefer even numbers to avoid tie votes that leave decisions unresolved. Each member serves a 5-year term, renewable once. We deliberately include people with conflicting viewpoints to ensure robust debate." Frank studied the list of names. "How many of these people were recruited the way we were?" Dr. Chen's expression flickered with something that might have been embarrassment. All of them. After 1995, we stopped approaching people directly. Every board member discovered evidence of historical crimes through what they believed was independent research or accidental discovery. We guided them to the evidence, but they found it themselves. So we're all victims of the same manipulation, Bobby said bitterly. You're all people who demonstrated the qualities we needed, Dr. Chen corrected. Intellectual curiosity, ethical commitment, the ability to handle disturbing information without becoming paralyzed by it. And most importantly, the wisdom to understand that simple solutions to complex problems often create more harm than good. Margaret looked at her three friends, seeing the same conflict she felt reflected in their faces. They were being asked to join an organization built on manipulation and delayed justice, but an organization that demonstrably achieved results that immediate exposure rarely did. It was a compromise that felt simultaneously necessary and wrong. We need one more thing, Margaret said finally. We want the Clearwater case prioritized. Full disclosure timeline accelerated. Those 47 victims and their families have waited over 50 years. That's long enough. Dr. Chen considered this. Clearwater was already scheduled for Phase 1 disclosure in 18 months. You're asking for immediate acceleration? We're asking for disclosure within 6 months, Margaret countered. Phase 1 within 3 months, contacting families. Full public disclosure at 6 months. We'll help with the work, but we won't wait years for justice that's already decades overdue. 6 months doesn't give us time for proper legal preparation, for ensuring all stakeholders are protected, for coordinating with academic institutions who'll analyze the evidence. Then we'll work faster, Frank said. You wanted outside perspective. This is it. 6 months for Clearwater, or we walk away and you lose 4 potencial board members who've already seen too much to ignore. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Finally, she nodded. 6 months for Clearwater, but you'll be working alongside our staff, following our protocols, doing this the right way. Agreed. Margaret extended her hand across the table. Agreed. The first ethics board meeting took place 3 weeks later at the Institute's headquarters in Arlington. Margaret had expected something clandestine, a hidden facility like the one beneath the factory. Instead, she found herself in a modern office building with the Institute's name displayed prominently in the lobby directory. The Institute for Historical Transparency operated openly, registered as a non-profit research organization. The secrets it protected were hidden in plain sight. The conference room was comfortable and professional, with a long table and chairs for all 16 board members. Margaret took her seat between Bobby and a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Lansing, a historian from Georgetown who specialized in Cold War-era intelligence operations. Around the table, the other board members were settling in, reviewing folders of materials that had been prepared for the meeting. Dr. Chen called the meeting to order and began with a case overview. Project Clearwater would be their primary focus for the next 6 months, but the board also needed to review 7 other active cases at various stages of disclosure preparation. A biological weapons testing program from the 1960s, medical experiments in federal prisons during the 1970s, illegal surveillance of anti-war protesters. Each case represented crimes that had been committed, covered up, and gradually forgotten by everyone except the victims and the Institute. The centerpiece of the meeting was an artifact that Dr. Chen placed carefully on the table. It was a personnel file, original documents from 1967, belonging to Dr. Edmund Voigt, the chief researcher at the Clearwater facility. The file contained his employment application, his security clearance paperwork, his performance evaluations, and most significantly, his personal correspondence with his supervisors. Margaret picked up the file carefully, noting the security classifications that had been stamped on nearly every page. Dr. Voigt had been recruited from a prestigious university, offered double his academic salary to conduct research, that he'd been told was vital to national security. The early correspondence showed enthusiasm, a belief that he was contributing to important work that would protect American lives. But the tone changed over time. Letters from 1969 showed growing concern about the ethical implications of the research. By 1970, Voigt was explicitly questioning whether the experiments had any legitimate scientific value or were simply torture masquerading as research. His final letter, dated February 1971, was a resignation attempt. He'd written to his supervisor requesting immediate termination of his contract and expressing his intention to report the program's activities to congressional oversight committees. The response to that letter was chilling. Voigt's supervisor had reminded him of the classified nature of his work, the legal consequences of unauthorized disclosure, and the fact that he'd signed documents accepting responsibility for any harm that came to research subjects. The message was clear. Voigt was complicit, and if he exposed the program, he would be prosecuted alongside everyone else involved. Dr. Voigt never did report the program, Dr. Chen explained. He stayed until the facility closed in March 1971, participated in the termination of the remaining subjects, and helped seal the evidence. He then returned to academic life and spent the next 27 years as a respected researcher in cognitive psychology. He died in 1998 without ever publicly acknowledging his role in Clearwater. Frank leaned forward, studying the correspondence. So he was a victim too, in a way. Coerced into participating, then blackmailed into silence. That's one interpretation, Dr. Patricia Lansing said. Another is that he made choices that prioritized his own safety over the lives of 47 people. He could have gone public despite the personal cost. Others have. The debate that followed was exactly what Margaret had hoped for when they'd agreed to join the board. Different perspectives, different ethical frameworks, different conclusions about how to present Voigt in the eventual disclosure. Some board members argued for portraying him as a complex figure who'd made terrible choices under pressure. Others insisted he should be presented as a perpetrator who'd knowingly participated in murder. Bobby raised a practical question. Do we know if Voigt has living family members? Children, grandchildren who'll be affected by how we portray him? Dr. Chen nodded. 2 adult children, both in their 60s now. We've been monitoring them, waiting for the right time to make contact. They know their father worked in classified research, but they don't know the details. They deserve to know, Diane said firmly. Before we make his crimes public, his family deserves a chance to process the information privately. This sparked another round of debate about the order of disclosure, the balance between protecting innocent family members and ensuring transparency. Margaret listened to the arguments, contributing her own perspective when appropriate, and realized this was exactly what the Institute needed. Not unanimous agreement, but thoughtful disagreement that forced everyone to defend their positions and consider alternatives. The meeting lasted 4 hours, and by the end, they'd established a preliminary timeline for Clearwater disclosure. Phase 1 would begin in 2 months with private contact to victims' families. Phase 2 would involve reaching out to families of perpetrators like Voigt. Phase 3 would be coordination with journalists and historians for public release. The entire process would take 6 months as they'd negotiated. But those 6 months would be intense and carefully orchestrated. As the meeting adjourned, Margaret felt the weight of what they'd agreed to undertake. They were going to expose crimes that powerful people had worked for decades to hide. They were going to force uncomfortable truths into public consciousness. And they were going to do it knowing that perfect justice was impossible, that some perpetrators would escape accountability through death or statute of limitations, but that the truth itself had value worth fighting for. 2 months into their work with the Institute, Margaret received a package at her home. It arrived by courier, requiring a signature marked as confidential. Inside was a single photograph, aged and faded, protected in archival plastic. The image showed a group of men in white lab coats standing outside the Patterson factory, dated September 1968. In the center of the group, smiling for the camera, was Dr. Edmund Voigt. Margaret stared at the photograph for a long time. This wasn't the face of a monster. It was the face of an ordinary man, perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes and a slight smile. He looked like someone's father, someone's husband, someone who might coach Little League or volunteer at church fundraisers. That ordinariness was somehow more disturbing than if he'd looked evil. She called Bobby, who'd received an identical package. They compared notes and discovered that each board member working on the Clearwater case had received a different photograph from the Institute's archives. Diane had received an image of the facility's interior, showing the clinical precision of the experimental chambers. Frank had received a photograph of Subject 23, Timothy Marsh, taken on his first day at the facility, still looking healthy and whole. The message was clear. The Institute was ensuring they never forgot the human reality behind the documents they were reviewing. These weren't abstract historical crimes. They were acts committed by real people against real victims, and any disclosure had to honor that reality. Margaret drove to Bobby's house that afternoon, finding him at his dining room table, surrounded by research materials. He'd been digging into the background of every staff member who'd worked at Clearwater, building comprehensive profiles that would inform how they approached families and structured the disclosure. "I found something," Bobby said, sliding a folder across the table to her. "Robert Vance, the subject whose name I share. I've been researching his background, trying to find family members we should contact." Margaret opened the folder and felt her breath catch. Robert Vance had been a drifter, picked up for vagrancy in Pittsburgh in 1966, but before that, he'd been a Korean War veteran honorably discharged, who'd struggled with what they'd called shell shock then and would recognize as PTSD now. He'd had a sister, Mary Vance, who'd spent years searching for him after he disappeared. Mary died in 2015. Bobby continued, his voice tight. But she left behind detailed records of her search. Letters to police departments, missing person reports, even a journal documenting every lead she followed. The Institute has all of it in their archives. He pulled out a photocopy of a journal entry, dated 1972. Mary Vance had written about her brother, about the kind man who'd come home from war changed and struggling, who'd lost his way but never his fundamental decency. She'd written about refusing to believe he'd simply abandoned his family, about her conviction that something terrible had happened to him. She was right, Bobby said. Something terrible did happen, and she died without ever knowing the truth. Margaret felt the familiar anger rising again, the frustration at a system that prioritized strategic disclosure over human need for closure. "This is why we're pushing for faster timelines," she said. "Every year we wait, more people like Mary die without answers." They spent the afternoon reviewing the files of all 47 Clearwater victims, identifying family members who were still alive and might be contacted. The list was depressingly short. Of the 47 victims, only 12 had known surviving relatives. Siblings mostly, now in their 70s and 80s. A few children who'd been very young when their parents disappeared. The rest had died without ever knowing what happened to their missing loved ones. Frank arrived in the evening, bringing Diane with him. They'd been working together on the logistical aspects of the disclosure, planning how to coordinate contact with multiple families simultaneously while providing adequate support and resources. Frank had experience in victim notification from his law enforcement background, and he'd been training the Institute staff on best practices. "We need to talk about the photograph," Frank said, setting down his own copy of the image he'd received. Timothy Marsh's face looked out at them from the archival plastic, young and doomed. "The Institute is going to use these images in the public disclosure. They want the full emotional impact. Is that wrong?" Diane asked. "These victims deserve to be seen, to be remembered as real people, not just case numbers." "It's not wrong," Frank said. "But it's manipulative. The same way they manipulated us into finding the factory. They're manipulating public emotion to maximize impact. Everything they do is calculated for effect. Margaret understood his concern. They'd agreed to work with the Institute because its methods achieved results. But those methods were based on manipulation and strategic emotional appeal. It was effective, but it was also ethically complex in ways that made her uncomfortable. Maybe that's our role, Bobby suggested. We can't stop them from being strategic, but we can make sure the strategy serves the victims rather than the Institute's institutional interests. We review every photograph they want to use, every document they want to release, and we ask ourselves who benefits from its inclusion. It was a good framework, and they spent the rest of the evening applying it to the preliminary disclosure plan the Institute had drafted. Some elements they approved without reservation. Others they challenged, demanding justification or suggesting alternatives. By midnight, they'd revised the plan significantly, shifting the focus more toward victim acknowledgement and less toward institutional condemnation. As Margaret drove home in the early morning hours, the photograph of Dr. Voigt sat on her passenger seat. She'd study it more tomorrow, trying to understand how an ordinary person became complicit in extraordinary evil, trying to figure out how to tell that story honestly, without either excusing his choices or denying his humanity. The day they made first contact with the victim's family arrived in early December. Margaret sat in a conference room at the Institute, reviewing the approach script one final time. Helen Marsh, Timothy's sister, would be their first contact. At 78, she was one of the younger surviving relatives, and according to the Institute's research, she'd spent decades searching for answers about her brother's disappearance. Dr. Chen had prepared a family contact package, a thick folder containing everything they would share with Helen, photographs of Timothy before the experiments began, medical records documenting what had been done to him, the final report noting his death, and most importantly, a handwritten letter that Timothy had managed to smuggle out of the facility in 1969, given to a maintenance worker who'd kept it hidden for 50 years before his own death led to its discovery and his effects. Margaret held the letter carefully, feeling the weight of words written in desperation. The paper was thin, the handwriting shaky, but the message was clear. Timothy had written to Helen, telling her he loved her, telling her to remember him as he'd been before, begging her not to blame herself for his disappearance. He'd written that whatever happened to him wasn't her fault, that he knew she'd done everything she could to find him. He knew he wasn't going to survive, Bobby said quietly, reading over Margaret's shoulder. He wrote this as a final goodbye. The letter had never been mailed. The maintenance worker who received it had been too afraid to send it, worried about the consequences if his role was discovered. He'd kept it hidden for decades, a secret that ate at him until his own death. His widow had found it while clearing out his belongings, and not understanding its significance, had donated his papers to a local historical society. The Institute had discovered it there 2 years ago during routine archive searches. This changes everything, Diane said. Helen doesn't just get to know what happened to her brother. She gets to hear from him one last time. Frank was less optimistic. It's going to destroy her. She spent 50 years wondering, and now she'll know that her brother was tortured to death while thinking about her. That's not closure. That's a new kind of grief. It's truth, Margaret countered. And she deserves it no matter how painful. We don't get to decide what she can handle. They drove to Philadelphia in 2 cars, Margaret and Dr. Chen in one, Frank and Bobby in the other. Diane had wanted to come, but agreed to stay behind, ready to document Helen's story once the initial contact was made, and she'd had time to process the information. Helen Marsh lived in a small apartment in a senior community. She greeted them at the door with a walker, her movements slow, but her eyes sharp with intelligence and curiosity. Margaret saw traces of Timothy in her face, the same bone structure, the same slightly crooked smile. "You're from that historical institute," Helen said, ushering them inside. "The one that called last week about my brother. I've been waiting for this for a very long time." They sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs of a life lived without the brother she'd lost. Margaret could see Timothy in several frames, young and smiling in pictures from the 1960s. Helen had never stopped displaying his photographs, never stopped acknowledging his existence, even when everyone else assumed he'd simply disappeared by choice. Dr. Chen began carefully, explaining the Institute's mission and how they'd discovered evidence of Project Clearwater. Helen listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her expression controlled, but her eyes beginning to fill with tears. When Margaret presented the folder, Helen's hands trembled as she opened it. She looked at each photograph, read each document, her face reflecting the progression from hope to horror to grief. And then Margaret gave her the letter. Helen read it 3 times, her tears falling freely now, her aged hands clutching the paper that her brother had touched 50 years ago. "He was thinking of me," she whispered. "At the end, he was thinking of me. He loved you very much," Margaret said softly. "That comes through in every word." Helen looked up at them, her face wet with tears, but her voice steady. "Thank you for bringing him back to me. Not his body, I understand that's not possible. But his voice, his love, his final thoughts. Thank you for letting me hear from him one more time." They stayed for 2 hours, answering Helen's questions, showing her additional documents, helping her understand the full scope of what had happened. Helen was stronger than Frank had given her credit for. Yes, the truth was devastating, but it was also liberating. She'd spent 50 years imagining scenarios, wondering if Timothy had suffered, if he'd thought about her, if he'd died alone and afraid. Now she knew he had suffered, but he'd maintained his humanity. He had thought about her, and while he died among enemies, he died knowing he was loved. As they prepared to leave, Helen held the letter to her chest. "Will other families get this kind of closure?" "We're working on it," Margaret promised. 11 more families will be contacted in the coming weeks. The full story will be made public in 6 months. Your brother's name will be remembered. What was done to him will be acknowledged." Helen nodded. "That's all I ever wanted. For someone to remember that he existed, that he mattered, that what happened to him was wrong." They drove back to Arlington in silence, each of them processing what they'd witnessed. Helen's grief had been real and raw, but so had her gratitude. This was why they'd agreed to work with the Institute, Margaret realized. Not for perfect justice, not for criminal prosecutions, but for this, giving families the truth and the acknowledgement they'd been denied for decades. 3 months into the disclosure process, Margaret received an unexpected visitor at her home. It was a Sunday morning, and she was reviewing files for the upcoming ethics board meeting when the doorbell rang. On her porch stood a man in his early 60s, well-dressed, with the careful posture of someone carrying a heavy burden. "Dr. Chen," he said. "Margaret Chen? I'm David Voigt. Edmund Voigt was my father." Margaret invited him in, her mind racing. The Institute had planned to contact the Voigt family next month, after all victim families had been notified. David's arrival meant he'd somehow learned about the investigation on his own. They sat in her living room, and David pulled an old journal from his briefcase. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Margaret recognized it immediately from the archive photographs. This was Edmund Voigt's personal journal, the one that documented his growing moral crisis during his years at Clearwater. "My father died in 1998, David began. "I found this journal when we were clearing out his house. I was 36 years old, and I thought I knew my father. He was a psychology professor, a respected researcher, a man who seemed dedicated to helping people understand the human mind. And then I read this." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The entry was dated November 1970, and Margaret could see Edmund Voigt's handwriting growing increasingly erratic across the page. The words spoke of subjects who'd lost their capacity for independent thought, of men and women reduced to empty vessels by the experiments he'd designed and implemented. "He knew what he was doing was wrong," David said. "Every page of this journal for 3 years, he knew, and he kept doing it anyway." Margaret listened as David explained how the discovery had shattered his understanding of his father. He'd spent 25 years carrying this knowledge alone, unable to share it because his father's work had been classified, unable to seek answers because everyone who might have provided them was dead or hidden behind government secrecy. "Last week, I received a letter from your institute," David continued, "informing me that you're preparing to make my father's crimes public, offering me counseling services and legal protection. Very thoughtful and professional. But I need to know something before that happens. I need to understand why he did it. Margaret could have redirected him to Dr. Chen or the Institute's staff. But looking at David's face, seeing the same struggle she'd witnessed in herself and her colleagues, she chose honesty instead. Your father was recruited to do important work for national security, she said. That's what he was told, and I believe he accepted it as true. The early journal entries show genuine conviction that the research would protect American lives. But somewhere along the way, the work became an end in itself. The experiments continued not because they were producing useful results, but because stopping would mean acknowledging they'd been wrong from the beginning. Sunk cost fallacy applied to human lives, David said bitterly. He couldn't stop, because stopping would mean admitting he'd already committed crimes. So he kept going, making it worse, trapping himself deeper. Margaret showed him the personnel file the Institute had compiled, including his father's resignation attempt and the response that had trapped him into continued participation. David read it with tears in his eyes, seeing his father as both perpetrator and victim, both architect of suffering and prisoner of his own choices. The Institute wants to present him as a monster, David said. And maybe they should. Maybe that's what he was. Or maybe he was a man who made terrible choices under pressure and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for them in the only way he knew how, Margaret suggested. She pulled out another document, one that showed Edmund Voigt's work after Clearwater. He'd spent his remaining years researching the psychological impact of coercion and institutional pressure, publishing papers that had influenced ethics guidelines for psychological research. He was trying to prevent others from making his mistakes, Margaret explained. It doesn't erase what he did, but it suggests he recognized the magnitude of his crimes and spent his life trying to ensure they wouldn't be repeated. David sat quietly for a long time, holding his father's journal. Finally, he looked up at Margaret. "What are you going to tell people about him?" "That's partly up to you," Margaret said. "The Institute's default position is to present the facts without interpretation. But as part of the Ethics Board, I can advocate for a more nuanced presentation, one that acknowledges both his crimes and his later efforts at redemption. The truth doesn't have to be simple. Will that help the victims' families?" David asked. Knowing that the man who tortured their loved ones felt bad about it later, it was the right question, the one that cut through all the philosophical complexity to the heart of the matter. Margaret didn't have a good answer. Some families might find comfort in knowing the perpetrators had suffered guilt. Others would see any sympathy for Edmund Voigt as a betrayal of his victims. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But I think they deserve the complete truth, even when it's complicated. Your father was neither a simple monster nor a tragic victim. He was a person who committed terrible crimes and lived with the consequences. That's the truth we need to tell." David left the journal with Margaret, asking her to ensure it was included in the Institute's archives and made available to researchers and victims' families. As he stood to leave, he had one final question. "Do you think my father deserves forgiveness?" Margaret considered carefully before answering. "That's not for me to decide. The only people who could forgive your father are the ones he hurt, and most of them are dead. But I think he deserves to be remembered as a complete person, not reduced to his worst acts. We all do." After David left, Margaret sat with the journal for hours, reading Edmund Voigt's words, watching his transformation from enthusiastic researcher to reluctant executioner to haunted survivor. The journal would become a crucial part of the Clearwater disclosure, humanizing the perpetrators without excusing their crimes, showing the complex reality of how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. The final Ethics Board meeting before public disclosure convened on a cold morning in March. exactly 6 months after Margaret and her friends had discovered the factory. The conference room was crowded now, with all 16 board members present, along with Institute staff who'd been working on the Clearwater project. On the table in front of them sat the culmination of 6 months of intensive work, a comprehensive disclosure package ready for release to journalists, historians, and the public. Dr. Chen distributed copies of the final report, a document running to over 300 pages with thousands of supporting files in digital appendices. Margaret opened her copy and felt a sense of accomplishment mixed with exhaustion. Every page had been debated, every fact verified, every conclusion challenged and defended. This wasn't just a historical document. It was a testament to what thorough, ethical disclosure could achieve. The report began with individual profiles of all 47 victims, presenting them as complete people rather than anonymous subjects. Timothy Marsh's story was there, including the letter to his sister and Helen's response when she learned the truth. Robert Vance's military service and subsequent struggles were documented with dignity and respect. Each victim was named, remembered, and mourned. The second section detailed the experiments themselves, drawing on medical records, research journals, and testimony from the few surviving staff members who'd agreed to talk. The Institute had located 3 former nurses and 1 laboratory technician who'd worked at Clearwater. Their interviews, conducted with legal immunity, provided first-hand accounts of the daily operations of the facility. Margaret had interviewed one of the nurses herself, a woman now in her 80s, who'd spent 50 years carrying the guilt of her participation. The nurse had explained how easy it was to rationalize her role, to tell herself she was just following orders, just doing her job, just trying to make the subjects as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. But she'd never forgotten their faces, their names, their suffering. The third section examined the institutional structure that had enabled Clearwater. This was the most politically sensitive part of the disclosure, naming not just the facility staff, but the supervisors, bureaucrats, and politicians who'd authorized and funded the program. Some of these people were still alive, still influential, and the Institute's lawyers had carefully reviewed every accusation to ensure it was legally defensible. Frank had pushed hard for this section to be as comprehensive as possible, arguing that accountability meant following the chain of command to its highest levels. The final version included names of 3 former senators, 2 CIA directors, and a dozen mid-level officials who'd signed off on Clearwater's operations. The fourth section was the most controversial among the board members. It presented Edmund Voigt and other perpetrators as complex figures, neither simple monsters nor tragic victims, but people who'd made terrible choices and lived with varying degrees of remorse. David Voigt's father's journal was quoted extensively, showing his moral struggle and eventual capitulation to institutional pressure. Some board members had argued this section provided too much sympathy to perpetrators. Others insisted it was essential to understanding how such programs could exist. Margaret had advocated for its inclusion, believing that preventing future atrocities required understanding how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. The report concluded with a section on the Institute itself, acknowledging its role in delayed disclosure while defending the approaches necessary to preserve evidence. This transparency about the Institute's methods was Margaret's contribution, something she'd fought for over Dr. Chen's initial resistance. "We're making ourselves vulnerable," Dr. Chen had argued during earlier debates, acknowledging our manipulation of recruits, our strategic delays, our calculated emotional appeals. "We'll be criticized for all of it." "We should be," Margaret had countered. "If we're demanding accountability from others, we need to hold ourselves to the same standard." The Institute's methods work, but they're ethically complex. That complexity deserves acknowledgement. The final version included a frank discussion of the Institute's recruitment and disclosure strategies, including how Margaret's group had been guided to discover the Clearwater facility. It was uncomfortable reading, but it was honest. Bobby raised the question everyone had been avoiding. Once this goes public, what happens to the factory itself? Does it become a memorial site? Is it demolished? Do we just leave it to rot in the forest? The Institute had prepared recommendations on this as well. The factory would be preserved as a historical site, with the basement levels converted into a museum and educational center. Victims' families would be consulted on the design, and the memorial wall in the disposal chamber would become the centerpiece. Those 23 names carved into concrete, serving as the foundation for remembering all 47 victims. "It feels wrong," Diane said quietly. "Turning the place where they suffered into a tourist attraction." "It's not a tourist attraction," Dr. Patricia Lansing responded. "It's a monument to truth. If we tear it down, we erase the physical evidence of what happened. If we preserve it, we ensure that future generations can see exactly what these programs looked like, how they operated, why they need to be prevented." The vote on the final report was unanimous. All 16 board members approved it for release, understanding that publication would bring intense scrutiny, criticism, and probably legal challenges. But it was ready. The truth was ready to be told. Dr. Chen stood at the end of the meeting, holding a thumb drive that contained the complete disclosure package. "This goes to the Washington Post tomorrow morning. Their investigative team has had preliminary access for the past month and has been fact-checking everything. Their story will publish simultaneously with our release of the full archive. Are we certain this is what we want?" Margaret looked around the table at her fellow board members, seeing the same mix of determination and apprehension on every face. Then she looked at her 3 friends, the people who'd shared this journey from accidental discovery to purposeful advocacy. "Release it," Margaret said. "It's time." The Washington Post story broke on a Sunday morning, the front page dominated by a photograph Margaret had seen before. Timothy Marsh, before the experiments began, smiling and whole. The headline read, "Project Clearwater, newly discovered documents reveal decades of illegal human experimentation." By noon, every major news network was covering the story. By evening, it had become international news. Margaret watched the coverage from her living room, feeling a strange disconnect between the story being told on television and the months of work that had led to this moment. Reporters interviewed experts who contextualized Clearwater within the broader history of unethical government programs. Ethicists debated whether delayed disclosure had been justified. Politicians expressed carefully worded outrage while avoiding any mention of their own party's historical complicity. Her phone rang constantly. Former students reaching out, academic colleagues seeking comment, journalists requesting interviews. She'd agreed to speak with 3 reporters who'd done their homework, who understood the complexity of the story rather than seeking simple sound bites. The interviews were exhausting, forcing her to articulate positions she was still forming, to defend decisions she wasn't entirely comfortable with. The public reaction split along predictable lines. Some praised the Institute for preserving evidence that might otherwise have been destroyed. Others condemned the delayed disclosure as complicity in covering up crimes. Conspiracy theorists emerged immediately, claiming the documents were fabricated or that the Institute was itself a government operation designed to control the narrative. Within days, trending hashtags appeared on social media, though Margaret didn't fully understand how that world worked. Bobby called her on the 3rd day after publication. He'd been monitoring academic and historical forums, tracking how scholars were receiving the disclosure. "It's working," he said, excitement clear in his voice. "Historians are already incorporating Clearwater into their research. Graduate students are proposing dissertations. The story isn't going to disappear the way MKUltra did. It's becoming part of the permanent historical record." Frank was less optimistic. He'd been contacted by several victims' families who were angry about the delayed disclosure, demanding to know why they'd been made to wait 6 months after the Institute had located them. One family was threatening legal action, claiming the Institute had no right to withhold information about their loved one's fate. Their right to be angry, Frank told Margaret over coffee. We made choices that prioritized historical preservation over immediate justice. That was strategic and probably necessary, but it wasn't what those families deserved. Diane had been following the artistic and cultural response to the disclosure. Several photographers and filmmakers had already contacted the Institute about documenting the factory site. Museums were requesting permission to display artifacts from the archive. There was talk of a documentary, a memorial exhibition, possibly even a feature film. Everyone wants to tell the story, Diane said. But I'm not sure everyone understands it. Some of these proposals feel exploitative, turning suffering into entertainment. The Ethics Board held an emergency meeting to address the flood of requests and responses. Dr. Chen looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes from days of non-stop media management. The Institute had received over 10,000 messages in 3 days, ranging from supportive to threatening. Several prominent politicians had called for investigations into the Institute itself, questioning its funding sources and its authority to withhold evidence. Margaret found herself defending the Institute's approach in ways she hadn't anticipated. She joined as a critic, determined to push for faster disclosure and greater transparency. But now, watching the chaotic aftermath of publication, she understood more deeply why the Institute had developed its careful, strategic methods. Immediate disclosure might have felt more righteous, but it would have resulted in exactly this chaos, without the careful preparation that had allowed them to control the narrative and protect the evidence. The most significant development came 2 weeks after publication. The Department of Justice announced a formal review of Project Clearwater, acknowledging the crimes documented in the disclosure and promising to pursue accountability where legally possible. It was mostly symbolic, given that most perpetrators were dead and statute of limitations had long since expired for many crimes. But it was official acknowledgement, something that rarely happened with historical government abuses. More importantly, Congress announced hearings on current oversight of classified research programs, using Clearwater as an example of what could happen without adequate accountability. This was what the Institute had been working toward, using historical disclosure to influence contemporary policy and prevent future abuses. Margaret received a letter that arrived by regular mail, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "Thank you for remembering my brother. He was a good man who deserved better. Your work gave him dignity in death that he was denied in life. Helen Marsh." She carried that letter to the next Ethics Board meeting, reading it aloud when discussions became heated about whether they'd made the right choices. "This is why we did it," she said. "Not for perfect justice, not for immediate accountability, but for this. For families who finally have answers, for victims who are finally acknowledged, for truth that will be part of the historical record forever." The meeting concluded with discussions of next steps. 7 other programs were at various stages of disclosure preparation. The Institute's work would continue for decades, slowly revealing the accumulated secrets of government misconduct. Margaret and her friends had committed to staying involved, serving their full 5-year terms on the Ethics Board and possibly beyond. As the meeting adjourned, Dr. Chen approached Margaret with a small package. "This arrived for you yesterday. It's from the Voigt family." Inside was Edmund Voigt's wedding ring, along with a note from David. "My father would want this to be part of the permanent record, not as a symbol of his innocence, but as a reminder that the people who committed these crimes were human beings, with families and lives beyond their worst acts. Included in the archive so future researchers never forget the complexity." Margaret held the ring, feeling its weight, understanding what David was offering. Not absolution for his father, but acknowledgement of his full humanity. It would become part of the Clearwater archive, displayed alongside victim artifacts. A reminder that understanding evil required acknowledging its ordinary origins. 6 months after the disclosure, Margaret stood at the entrance to what had once been the Patterson protein processing factory. The transformation was remarkable. The building had been stabilized and partially restored, the dangerous sections sealed off, but the historical integrity preserved. A small parking area had been created near the old access road, and tasteful signage marked the site as the Project Clearwater Memorial and Education Center. She'd returned with Frank, Diane and Bobby for the official dedication ceremony. Helen Marsh was there, along with 8 other family members of Clearwater victims. David Voigt had also come, standing apart from the others. His presence, a quiet acknowledgement of his father's role in this history. The memorial wall from the disposal chamber had been relocated to the entrance. Those 23 names carved in concrete, now serving as the foundation for a larger monument. Brass plaques had been added, listing all 47 victims with brief biographies. Timothy Marsh, 34, Korean War veteran, brother, friend. Robert Vance, 35, Korean War veteran, brother, son. Sarah Chen, 28, aspiring teacher, daughter, sister. Each name accompanied by a reminder that these were people with lives and families, not just subjects in an experiment. Dr. Chen gave a speech about the importance of remembering historical wrongs, about the responsibility to ensure such programs could never be repeated. She spoke about the Institute's work and its commitment to eventual disclosure of all the secrets it protected. Margaret noticed she didn't mention the manipulation, the strategic delays, the calculated emotional appeals. Some truths were still too uncomfortable to speak aloud. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she chose honesty. 6 months ago, my friends and I stumbled onto this place by accident, or so we thought. We've since learned that nothing about our discovery was accidental, that we were guided here as part of a recruitment strategy. That manipulation was wrong, but it led us to work that matters. We've spent 6 months ensuring that the people who suffered here are remembered, that their stories are told accurately, that their families have answers. She paused, looking at Helen Marsh, who nodded encouragement. We didn't achieve perfect justice. Most of the people responsible for these crimes are dead. Those who remain alive will likely never face prosecution. But we achieved something else. We ensured the truth survived. We gave families closure. We created a historical record that can't be erased or denied. That's not nothing. That's worth the compromises we made to achieve it. After the ceremony, Margaret walked through the memorial with Helen. The basement levels had been converted into exhibition space, displaying artifacts and documents from the Clearwater archive. Timothy's letter to his sister was there, protected behind glass. His words of love, preserved for anyone who wanted to understand the human cost of these programs. Helen stopped at her brother's section of the memorial, touching the brass plaque with his name. I used to dream about finding him, she said quietly. For years, I'd wake up certain that this would be the day someone called with information. And then decades passed, and I stopped dreaming, stopped hoping. I thought I'd die without ever knowing. She turned to Margaret, tears in her eyes but smiling. Thank you for giving me those last words. Thank you for letting me know he died thinking of me, that he loved me to the end. That's worth waiting 50 years to hear. Bobby had been examining the exhibition on the facility's operations, reading the descriptions of Edmund Voigt's role with particular interest. David Voigt stood nearby, and after a moment's hesitation, Bobby approached him. I know this must be difficult, Bobby said. Having your father remembered this way? David nodded. It is, but it's also necessary. He did terrible things, and those things deserve to be remembered. But he was also my father, and he wasn't only those terrible things. The exhibition captures that complexity. I'm grateful for it. They talked for a while, 2 men connected by history in ways neither could have predicted. Bobby shared what he'd learned about the Robert Vance, who died here, the distant relative whose name they shared. David talked about growing up with a father who'd seemed haunted by secrets he couldn't share. They found common ground in their shared belief that truth mattered, even uncomfortable truth, even truth that complicated simple narratives. Frank and Diane had walked down to the disposal chamber, now part of the memorial tour. The industrial incinerator still stood there, but it was accompanied by educational displays explaining its purpose and the lives that had ended there. It was difficult to see, but Frank believed difficulty was appropriate. Easy memorials let people forget too quickly. As evening fell, the small group gathered outside the factory one last time. The dedication ceremony was over, but none of them seemed ready to leave. This place had changed their lives, had drawn them into work they'd never imagined undertaking, had forced them to grapple with moral complexities that had no easy answers. "We should hike together soon," Margaret said, pulling out her trail journal. "Just the four of us like we used to. Back to simple trails and ordinary discoveries. After everything we've seen, can any discovery be ordinary anymore?" Diane asked, but she was smiling. "Maybe that's the point," Bobby suggested. "We keep hiking, keep exploring, keep being curious about the world. But now we do it knowing that history is never as simple as it appears. That every abandoned building might hold secrets. That truth is worth pursuing even when it's complicated." Frank nodded toward the factory, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. "This place will stand for decades, maybe centuries. Long after we're gone, people will come here to learn about what happened. That's our legacy. Not perfect justice, but permanent memory." Margaret made a final entry in her journal, number 47, the one that had documented the hike that changed everything. She wrote about compromise and complexity, about justice delayed but not denied, about truth that survived because people chose to preserve it rather than expose it prematurely. She wrote about 47 people who died in this place and were now remembered, their suffering acknowledged, their humanity restored, as they walked back to their cars. Margaret looked back one last time at the factory. It stood solid against the darkening sky, no longer hidden by forest overgrowth, no longer forgotten. It had become what it needed to be, a testament to truth, a reminder of the cost of secrecy, and a promise that some crimes, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually be brought to light.